So, without further ado, I'm going to talk about the privilege of play today. Um, and yeah, I'll jump into the problem. I think there's two parallel histories. I'm indebted here to some Taro Fickle's thinking about race in Unix in the 1960s. Kind of trying to take that idea, amplify it, and bring some different contours to the conversation out. But we have a history of games that we know about and history of civil rights in America. The history of civil rights in America um, can be epitomized by some of the conversations in the 60s and 70s had by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, conversations about social equity, um, uh, uh, living conditions, all sorts of things happening over the course of the 20th century. But also in the 20th century, we have a history of games that often goes from Dungeons and Dragons to Rogue to Ultima to Skyrim. And that's it. That's the complete history of games, which is a joke. But you can see the issue is that these two things are parallel. They're happening in parallel. They're conversations that are happening alongside each other, and they're not really talking to each other. So the goal of this talk and the privilege of play as a book overall is to take this conversation about games and this conversation about civil rights and really kind of bring them together into a singular conversation that really tries to show how they're more porous than it might at first seem. So one of the key terms that I use here for kind of picking this conversation out is this term I use in the book called network privilege, and just kind of going over some uh, uh, quick highlights of what that term means. Network privilege means that from a structural standpoint, whiteness is positioned as invisible in outside discussions about race. To have race is to be non-white, and to be white is to control the conversation about who is visible and who is not. White privilege is a set of concrete material advantages that are socially given to white people, but it's also an affect. Here I'm promise of a middle class suburban lifestyle. And so, network privilege, this term that I've come up with and I use throughout the book, is the privilege granted to those who operate within predominantly white male networks. Importantly, network privilege is available to all participants in these networks, regardless of race or gender. So, if you are able to hang with this network, you will gain the by the network. Um, and then, sure. Um, Yeah, so drawing on Sarah Ahmed's work, white privilege is a set of concrete material advantages that are socially given to white people. But here's where Ahmed comes in. It's also an affect, an orientation produced by the implicit social promise of a middle class suburban lifestyle. So it's a feeling that people have that they should be entitled to something. Network privilege, importantly, is the privilege granted to those who operate within predominantly white male networks. And importantly, it's available to all participants in these networks, regardless of race or gender. And that's my term, network privilege. So finally, when we discuss games, access to leisure determines who has been afforded network privilege. So for me, that's a really important thing in this conversation is you actually need access to leisure, which is a lot of things about your race, your gender, your social class, etc in order to have the benefits of network privilege. So, kind of at the heart of the book is the Tech Model Railroad Club, which was this group in MIT in the 1960s. I believe it still exists today, but they're really, really famous in sort of tech history and game history for being the crux of a lot of innovation um, in uh, in the 1960s. They famously produced what is often seen as the first video game, Space War. And there's other conversations like for tennis for two and stuff, but for purposes of this talk, we'll just lean on what has been famous for a long time, which is Space War, which was played on a PDP-1 microcomputer at MIT. But also, if you read uh, Stephen Levy's book, Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution, you'll also know that they're famous for iterating on what has become known today as the Hacker Manifesto, which is a series of logics that most hackers and people working in technology actually kind of internalize and think through as insofar as uh, how they view the world. So I kind of want to scrutinize the Tech Model Railroad Club because I think that you can see a lot of the themes of this book around privilege and play coming from this key moment in tech and video game history where this one group basically, at least as the story is often told, created a profound influence. So just to kind of go over hacker culture, this is in the hacker ethic in Stephen Levy's book. Levy argues that from the Tech Model Railroad Club, we get ideas like access to computers and anything which might yield something about the way the world works should be unlimited in total, always yield to the hands-on imperative. The phrase that we all know very well, all information should be free, was popularized by them. The sort of mistrust authority, promote decentralization vibe also comes from the Tech Model Railroad Club. The idea of meritocracy, hackers should be judged by their hacking and not bogus criteria such as degrees, age, race, sex, or position. Um, the one point here that I really still kind of do agree with, you can create art and beauty on a computer. Imagine a time when that wasn't a way we thought about computers. And finally, the idea that computers can change your life for the better. So these are some of the big tech ideas that come out of the Model Railroad Club. Um, but the issue here is that when we talk about the Tech Model Railroad Club, and when Levy looks at it, he really identifies this one subset in the club called the Signals and Wires Subcommittee. So these were the people in charge of getting underneath the sort of dioramas of the sort of landscapes they would make for the model trains to go around on, wire them, create switches for the trains to go back and forth. And yeah, so these wound up people who are really interested in technology. I argue that the culture of the club is actually much deeper. And that if you look at the culture, you can't just understand the culture of this club by looking at the people who did the tech for the club. You could also look at what I jokingly call the paper mache and scissors subcommittee, which was the group that kind of created everything, painted the things, built the buildings, and created the landscapes. And this is a group that's more tied to hobby culture, which throughout this book and throughout this talk, I'm going to argue is really, really indebted to sort of white male American culture. Um, that has some paradoxical perspectives on its own identity. So here are two. The first is that hobbyists see themselves as outsiders because they've been powered by white privilege, but they feel excluded from the domain of hegemonic masculinity to which they feel entitled. So these aren't the jocks winning sports games and stuff like this. These are, the geeks. We know this part of the story, but it kind of creates a paradox because geeks see themselves as outsiders because they get bullied in high school, they get bullied in middle school, but still within this sort of space of white male hobbyists. I'm going to argue that there was a sense that this geek culture was entitled to some kind of privilege, specifically white male privilege. The other thing to know about hobby culture that I would argue specifically is that hobbyists are tech savvy because the skills that they learn are often shared within a sphere of supportive masculinity. That's a point that you can see in much other writing on it, like Christina Dunbar Hester's wonderful works on geeks and geek hobbyists. But the twist here for me is that hobbyists often feel stuck in their careers because they position themselves as outsiders. And thus, right, because they see themselves as these sort of outsiders in the offices, they miss many of the opportunities afforded to those who have embraced a total typical insider sociality, right? These aren't the people working in finance necessarily. Again, these are the people tinkering on computers. They don't see themselves as belonging to that domain of hegemonic masculinity. This is also indebted to T.L. Taylor's work on geek masculinity. So there's a lot of paradoxes kind of embedded in hobby culture. And I argue that it's really important to understand these paradoxes to get into that space where we understand the influence of the groups like the Tech Model Railroad Club, but also in some ways why video games have continued to be so white in so many ways. So I want to take you back into the past. Let's think about model railroads because that predates the Model Railroad Club at MIT. goes back to the dawn of the 20th century, and it's something that I think is fascinating and that not enough people talk about. At the dawn of the 20th century, model railroads were just becoming really, really popular, and they were getting popularized specifically because they were something to do with electricity. Uh, Electricity was just getting rolled out into the infrastructure at this time, and because of that, not everybody had access to it. And just like when you get your phone today, if you paid a lot of money to get electricity in your house, it was an exciting thing, and you'd want to show it off. So on our phones today, we have killer apps. Back at the dawn of the 20th century, you had model trains. Um, and not only that, but stores like Sears, Macy's, these sort of big box department stores that would be in the main street of every town, would use model trains during the holidays to advertise to people about how many cool things that you could find in that store. It was a way to draw a crowd around the sort of window displays, and it was an exciting way to generate enthusiasm about the wares that the store might be selling with electricity, of course. So, flash forward to the 1950s, and model trains are actually a sensation. Every boy in the 1950s would be really excited to get them around Christmas time. They just became a sort of cultural sensation. And the question for me as a historian is like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? These are things that we don't talk that much about anymore. And the story there is really interesting. You have this guy in the 1930s named A.C. Kalmbach, who ran a small religious press in the Midwest, and he was a model train hobbyist and enthusiast. And so basically, he started with his press a magazine called Model Railroader, and with Model Railroader, he chose to popularize model trains and became almost like a proselytizer for model trains, sending model railroads to all department stores, seeing if they'd carry it on their shelves, but also trying to get on the phone with them, tour around with them, and convince them of the value of model trains as part of their product line. He was really just like kind of touring America, trying to get in there and explain to people that model trains were really, really exciting and the sort of things that could draw people to their stores and their displays. So Comeback is this like really, really fascinating person taking model trains on the road in the 1930s. And to kind of understand what that influence had, it made me as a historian want to read through model railroader magazines to understand what kind of culture model train hobbyists came from, like Kalmbach. Um, the answer probably won't be surprising, as you can see in these pictures. It's really a culture full of white men and often their sons, like depicted on today's Lionel model train calendar. This was a popular model train company, Lionel. This is a sort of typical illustration that you could have found in almost any um, calendar or model railroad magazine from the 1930s when Kalmbach started publishing them until today. Um, what would you find in Model Railroader? Well, first, many of the covers, honestly, are variations on the one that you have on the left right here, where you have Dad and his son tinkering, painting, doing many of the things that they can do with model trains. If you open up the pages inside, you'd find instructions for how to assemble trains, how to wire your tracks, how to paint and beautify your landscapes. You'd also get some historical pieces about like why this technology was used at this train at this time or that train at that time. So there's lots of really interesting stuff in there. In terms of advertisements, you would find advertisements like the one you see on the right, advertising things like the sexy new HO track, which was a smaller sort of gauge of model railroad track, easier to assemble too. So here's an image kind of trying to explain to the reader why they should buy it. And so implicit here, right, is who this magazine really is for, and in some ways who this hobby really is for, and that is Dad. It's Dad trying to enjoy a hobby that he might be into. One of my very favorite things that you can find in Model Railroader is a complete fan fiction sort of odyssey about a dad and his son who try to build model train tracks together. They put it into the attic of their house, and then mom finds out and she gets mad. But dad argues that it's good for bonding with his son. And of course, the son's so excited about this model railroad train track that he tells all of his friends in the neighborhood, and then they start inviting dad over to their houses to help them build model train tracks in their basements and stuff like that. And on it goes, as mom in those houses then gets really upset by this sort of work, etc., etc. So, of course, this is a very white, male, and heteronormative sort of view of the world. Um, and there's more evidence of this in Model Railroader as well. This is a comic by John Kalmbach, not to be confused with Alan Kalmbach, the person who published Model Railroader. But the Silver Plate Road follows this man, I believe his name is Val, and his sort of antics. And so basically, the joke in every Silver Plate Road comic that gets rolled out is that Val is so interested in model trains that he would rather be doing model trains than almost anything else. So he's in bed on his honeymoon, and he finds a way to sneak out to find another room to use his portable model train set. He's at a bachelor party, and him and his friends are huddled in the corner talking and playing with model trains. Um, and so in the top frame here, you see here Val getting lectured by his wife, who, of course, is always depicted as a nag, about blocking the laundry. And here you see one of the only Black people here in the image, the help, Lily, who is trying to do the laundry. And then here in the bottom comic, again, you see Val, who is apparently now an ambassador at some fancy gathering. Not actually at the gathering because he's with his friends downstairs. But you can see in the back of the gathering, again, you have the help depicted as a Black man carrying drinks around. And of course, these Black folks aren't just Black folks. They're depicted in a very stereotypical way. And you can also just see the class disparity evident here as Val has wealth and access to the tools that he would need to play with model trains whenever he wants, while the Black people are barely covered in these comics, and when they are always incontrovertibly the help. And so when we think about the Tech Model Railroad Club, I argue that Levy's work on the topic, thinking about the whole culture of like hackers and hobbyists going from the 1960s to today, really only tells half the story. And it tells the half of the story that positions this club in a particularly positive light as sort of innovators of the computer revolution, with people like Slug Russell, the guy who created Space War, as the sort of great male innovator of computer games and video games. And I kind of argue that that's only half the story, and that if you want to see the other half of the story, you have to look at model railroad culture. And looking at that, you can actually see that this was a really sharply curated white male culture that was about how to play with model trains. And that was also part of what was being incubated there at MIT, was the export of this culture and some of the cultural attitudes that the people in this culture had, which you can see within that concept of network privilege. So what does this all have to do with games? We know here we're talking about Space War, but that's just one game. And the story, if you start looking at games that weren't digital games, but influenced digital games, goes far deeper. There was a wargaming magazine called the Avalon Hill General that basically was used to popularize and sell games that Avalon Hill produced. Famously, they produced Diplomacy. They also produced games like Risk. But here you have Avalon Hill. Before they became a really, really, really popular game producing company, had to basically create a fan base for their games. So they did this in a few ways. One of the ways they did this is by advertising in Model Railroader. This was a hobby magazine, and so they thought model railroad hobbyists might be interested in it. And so you'd go to Model Railroader, and it would be normal to not only find advertisements for Avalon Hill, but you'd find advertisements for their games, their war games, and games like Diplomacy. Diplomacy which is one of their most famous games and was absolutely a phenomena in the wargaming world throughout the 60s, was really important because it's a simulation of World War One, and to play diplomacy well, you actually need a table of 7 people exactly to play the different nations in the game. The problem is, if you've ever tried to get 7 people together to play a game, especially a game that's kind of vicious, that is known colloquially as like the friendship breaker, you might find that it's hard to find 7 people. So Avalon Hill created this column in each of their magazines called Opponents Wanted, where they would basically court people like it was like almost like a relationship wanted ad to play games of diplomacy. And so this started as like a very small column in some of their early magazines, but by the later magazines, you would just find pages and pages of Opponents Wanted, like 3 or 4, just like looking like classified ads of people with their own fanzines and their own networks trying to find friends to play diplomacy with. These games would be played through Post, and people would basically create what we would call, I guess, in the 90s, web rings, but rings of friends that they'd send fanzines out to that would also have the moves of diplomacy in them. So it did a tremendous thing to the story that we have and the understanding we have of hobby games over the course of the 20th century. I ran some visualizations of these networks. I have some images in the book, basically where I took the zip codes of all of these magazines fanzines that would be published by fans on diplomacy, and did a time lapse to see how they grew over time. And the interesting thing that you see there is that as fanzines boom in the cities and then move out to the suburbs, it basically corresponds with a mapping of white flight in America over the 60s, 70s, and 80s. White flight was already well underway at this time, but you see basically the trend is that people, if they were publishing from a city, would be publishing from a city in the year or so that they went to college. Then they moved to the suburbs, and basically that's where they would publish until they finished and ceased their publication. So that's more evidence to show that these are sort of white male networks that got kind of incubated in the hobby community. Also, evidence here is, looking at the publishers. I looked at 2 kinds of publishing rings of diplomacy fanzines here. One was a ring that was edited by Penelope Nauden Dickens. This is the pouch, one of the fanzines in this ring. And Dickens was interesting because she was a woman publishing at this time, and I was curious to see what she would be publishing, because surely she, of all people, would be resisting some of the sort of typical sensibility of the sort of white male network of hobbyists. And she did. In some ways, she argued against some of her friends that were bullying people, using racial slurs and homophobic slurs in the pages. But at the same time, you found passages like this, which display a sort of white liberal mindset. She writes, this is on a story going to DipCon 4 in Chicago. If you grew up in New York City or any other large city for that matter, you become accustomed to air pollution and fights over it and the like. Well, I've been to LA, San Francisco, and Chicago, and a few other high pollution areas, as well as Pittsburgh, I might add. In all my life, I have never seen a more disgusting display of air pollution than in Gary, Indiana. The whole city was one great belching smokestack with clouds of yellow and black smoke pouring out from every structure in the town. Gary, Indiana is a disgrace to humanity and a revolting spectacle of the ability of massive corporations to overpower the concerns for health and clean air that miraculously work their way through our political system. The very thought of the town makes me sick. And so, on the one hand, a lot of the values in this quote might be values that we agree with. Like, I surely don't like large corporations creating pollution and contributing to climate change. But on the other hand, coded here are a lot of dog whistles about Gary, Indiana, which is a very black town. And of course, that pollution's there because it's a low income area. And so part of what Dickens, who is on the sort of left end of these hobby communities, is arguing here is, I don't really want to go to a black town. That's an uncomfortable place for her to be spending time in, clearly, as you can see in this passage. And so what's not said there is about the population of Gary, Indiana. And this was a sort of common trope on the Avalon Hill General. I skimmed through all the covers of the Avalon Hill General to see where Black representation was. And there was two images. One was a cartoon from the 80s of a bunch of school kids running out into the schoolyard, and there was a Black school kid in that area. The other is this man who is the chauffeur to the man in the back, Elwood Gardner, who is giving out $1,000 bills, which don't exist. It's a sort of Trumpy sort of joke about how, look at these people, they're so foolish for thinking you could get $1,000 bills. It was an ad for a game that they had called Squander, which was very sarcastic. More importantly, though, on the very first page, the cover of the first page of the Avalon Hill General is this quote: "There is no Mr. Avalon, nor is there a Mr. Hill. The first games were published in a Baltimore suburb, Avalon, high up on a hill, literally overlooking the genteel plantation land of picturesque South Baltimore. It was there that Gettysburg was conceived, labor of love, in which the famous Civil War battle was rehashed time and time again by admitted Confederate sympathizers in the border state of Maryland. Southern loyalties ran high. One of the very first correspondents was an elderly Alabama gentleman who was having the time of his life, quote, slaughtering those damn Yankees." So as a Black person myself, I read this quote and it makes me kind of upset. It definitely makes me not excited to read the contents of the Avalon Hill General, describing this area as plantation-esque land, talking about sort of empathizing with Confederate sympathizers, rehashing Civil War battles. All these things that Avalon Hill General was selling itself on, even though this was a hit game of theirs, Gettysburg, were kind of troubling ways to think through the sort of racial politics of the time. And so, of course, this is one of the ways that the hobbyist community continued to sort of groom itself and make sure that there weren't that diverse of a representation within it. And this continues. This is a game, Origins of World War II, that Avalon Hill published in the early 70s. And you can see the tagline on it of this issue that advertises it is "Who Really Started World War II?" And yes, this is actually a game based on white supremacist literature from the time, arguing that Hitler didn't himself start World War II. Instead, it was more of a contested space between other leaders who were sort of agitating at the time that it might be. And so this is based on very famous white supremacist texts that were circulating in the community. And even they did run, to their credit, the Avalon Hill General, they did run a bunch of fan critiques of the game, both positive and negative in this issue. And here you have some fans like Jerry Pournelle, who was also very influential in the space. He was an author, president of the American Science Fiction Association, also a neoconservative who advised Ronald Reagan on strategic use of technology. He argued that this was actually a little too wacky for him, this sort of questioning of Hitler. So it wasn't completely uncontested here, but it was advertised on the cover of their issue, as were things like Erwin Rommel, who was a sort of Robert E. Lee equivalent in World War II, the quote good general who fought for the wrong cause. So he was a Nazi general that there are still fans of. You can find them on Board Geek today, who thought he was great. But here's Stonewall Jackson, a Confederate general, kind of in a valiant glamour shot. And of course, this is the worst issue cover that I could find. Here's Hitler rising above all of the other generals in World War II. So again, you sort of have this mode of white supremacy explicitly being displayed on many of the covers of the Avalon Hill General, with a sort of alibi that this is about wargaming, but also definitely not a really inviting way to have a sort of inclusive community of gamers. So that's kind of also grooming and cultivating the sort of network privilege, and who has access to that network privilege in the 60s and 70s. On the extreme right side of this, beyond the Avalon Hill General, beyond Penelope Naughton Dickens' work in The Pouch and the New York Conspiracy Publishing Ring. You have people like Robert Bryan Lipton, who had a very conservative sort of conspiracy theory-minded mindset, and he published things like this in his journal, fanzine, the Mixu Maxu Gazette, talking about his ideal president. And I apologize for the language here, but I think using the accurate quote is important. The ideal president should be dead. Think of how despised politicians became noble statesmen as soon as they're in their graves. Didn't you despise the Kennedy brothers until they were killed? Wasn't Martin Luther King Jr. A pushy nigger until 1968? Didn't the New York Times, who hated Johnson while he lived, give him a beautiful obituary? Wasn't Lincoln, who couldn't control his Congress and told jokes at the worst possible times, elected to godhood? So clearly here, it's not even a dog whistle, right? Like, this is just anti-Black sentiment circulating very easily as parody in the fanzine community. So you have the range of these political spectrums, but all of them on some level were sort of concerned with or cautious about Black people and people of color, for the most part, entering into their community. This is problematic because the games that this community pioneered, games like Axis and Allies, games like Dungeons and Dragons, which was in fact an offshoot of the Diplomacy Zine fan community, were really foundational to games that we have today. Dungeons and Dragons, for example, gave us attribute scores, which are still used in games today, in many games today, as ways to think through what characters are, what characters can do, and how their attributes work. And also, if you go to the convention scene, you have places like Game Developer Convention, E3, and Gen Con. You have essays from people in all of these spaces writing about how E3 doesn't exist anymore, but writing about how white these communities are, how male these communities are, how hard it is to get along with the culture. I think Maddie Bryce's essay in First Person Scholar, maybe First Person Scholar, about GDC always resonates me on this level, feeling like it's such an alien, hostile place. And I can just say, I don't want to speak much about it, but I do consulting work for Gen Con on this problem specifically, because they recognize that the space is has historically been white, and they really want to make a difference and change that as well. Here's a quote from Ajit George, who is a hobby gamer. He edited the collection for Dungeons and Dragons, Journeys to the Radiant Citadel, which came out last year, I think last year, maybe the year before, and was a really awesome collection because it embraced BIPOC authors for the first time in the game's history. But before he did this, he wrote about going to Gen Con in 2014 and said, "I'm the first of my family to be born in the United States, the child of immigrants. I struggled between cultures. I was the only non-white kid in the neighborhood and one of only half dozen minorities in my high school. I was an outsider." Again, there's that sort of hobbyist language. "I found refuge in Dungeons and Dragons my freshman year. I could escape who I was in those heroic characters and epic stories. I could be someone I was not. I could be strong. I could be fierce. And the heartbreaking line, I could be white. As an awkward teen, like other awkward teens, I wanted to be accepted, but acceptance meant something different to me, as perhaps it does to other minority teams. Acceptance meant being white." And then he talks about how Gen Con needs to diversify, a task that they've taken on today, but it's just evidence you can see in the hobby community itself, even presently, contemporarily, these conversations that had been squelched in the 60s and 70s, or weren't maybe so apparent at that point, are still happening today. People feeling left out, people feeling not included because of the social contours of the community. You also see this in board game publishing on sites like Board Game Geek. On the top left, you have their old logo, which was affectionately termed the Aryan logo. The bottom right, they've updated this about 4 years ago to the orange logo, which is somehow better than the Aryan logo. But you had similar problems in the Board Game Geek, the board game hobby, that have also been addressed in the community. Here you have, in the wake of the 2020 renewed interest in civil rights and Black life, you have a very famous board game reviewer on the top left That's Tom Vassell talking to his friend and a very famous board game designer and one of the only Black designers working in the industry, Eric Lang. And here Lang describes to Tom Vassell how difficult it's been for him to get by in the community, what it means to find a seat at the table, the anxiety he has waiting for that racist joke to happen. And you can see in this image, Tom is visibly sweating during the conversation as he tries to make space for his friend to explain his experience. But at the same time, as sort of like white male proselytizer of board games himself, I think Tom may have felt a little responsible for this zeitgeist, and also might not have even felt like it existed or it was a problem. So you have a really interesting conversation between these two figures of making space and kind of trying to negotiate that problem today. The bottom, you also have another very famous board game designer. This is Rado, not designer, reviewer. This is Rado. He's wearing his Black Lives Matter shirt, so he's clearly an ally. He started donning this after the George Floyd killing in 2020, of course. And Rado is a really interesting person in this space because Rado was also the creative director for the digital games The Sims. So I like to point out Rado here because it's one way that you can point out there's some people in the community are allies today, and I call these the sort of new guard of geeks, challenging the sort of ways the old guard of geeks that have come up through the sort of Avalon Hill system, these hobby networks. But the new guard of geeks, people like Rado, people like Elizabeth Hargrave, are really advocating for diversity. And there's also connections between them very clearly in the digital game community. There's definitely a sort of porous transaction there. Those are two parallel histories as well. So to summarize, I'll get into anything you all want to talk about in a minute, but I really hope that from this talk, it inspires you to make space for BIPOC creators, fans, stories, histories, and feelings in games. And I also hope it encourages you to recognize and dismantle the white supremacy, privilege, and networks that drive the industry. These conversations are kind of endemic to the hobby game industry, but they're also endemic to a lot of other hobby industries. And I also think that today in a lot of other hobbies, because you have a sort of hobby culture that's becoming more reliant on crowdfunder and sort of populist technologies to get the word out and inspire people to do hobbies. A lot of hobbies are diversifying in similar ways. And here you're also finding these similar exciting conversations and maybe even the frontier of civil rights in America today. So thank you all for your time, and I'm really looking forward to any questions you might have. Sure. Hi, folks. I've heard there's a small tech issue. So if you have a question and you want to type it in or say it, I'd be very happy to address it. I think you are unmuted, so would love to hear any questions you might have. If things are being said, I am not getting the audio, unfortunately, which is perhaps a question for the tech gurus behind the screen. Yeah, I think if you read it, should I repeat it if you read it? Okay, read the question to me because I don't have access to Twitch chat on hand. I'll try to pull it up. Sorry, everybody. I'm trying to pull up the Twitch. I have not looked into the prevalence of white supremacists or lack of prevalence of white supremacists in the Warhammer 40K community specifically. There's a few reasons for that. The first is that it's a great question. But the first is that this project really does focus in on the conversation around race in America, and Games Workshop is a UK-based company. So there's a small difference there. The other part of the conversation is I think a lot of those conversations I would say are really happening in present right now today. And so I didn't really steer too deeply into them. I did read, I think Charlie Hall has a great essay on Polygon about the white supremacists in Warhammer 40K, where it's argued that basically there's also an anti-white supremacist sentiment in that community, and so it's a really contested space occurring right now there. It might be Jordan Carroll, now that I think about it, who wrote that article, who's an academic who writes amazing stuff on the topic. But I do know that there have been some people who have done some research on that, and yeah, it is a problem. I know Games Workshop is aware that it's a problem. And I know that it's being negotiated and navigated by the community right now today. In relationship to my work, I think that it's sort of a spillover sentiment from the sort of stuff that you see that Avalon Hill putting out there, where hobby games have historically been a sort of provenance of some white supremacist ideology mixed in with some conservative ideology and a dash of more liberal progressive ideology. So with all these things, it's complicated, and I would never want to say all hobbyists are this or that, but I do think that you have a mix of people that is weighed a little more conservatively than in some other subcultural groups, which is why it's such an interesting space to look at. Great question. What other questions are there? Oh, perfect. Thank you. Yes. Next question is, does the prevalence of white supremacy in gaming have some relation to the genre of the game itself? That's an interesting question. So I guess a different way to think about that question is like, does wargaming lead to white supremacy in a different way than like cozy gaming or farming sims might? In some ways, my heart really wants to say no, because I don't want that to be the answer to the question. But analytically, when I do think about the history of the materials I've looked at, I do think that there's something about wargaming specifically that has kind of invited and encouraged these communities to be interested and excited about them. I write about this in the book a little more in chapter 2. I talk about the difference between simulation and simulationism. Simulation is like what the military uses today. It's like when you model ballistics and you use this to predict the future. So simulations are run specifically for their predictive value, so that you can understand how to predict the future and deal with the future. And so that's like their explicit military or corporate purpose in society. Whereas simulationism, which is a term that I coined in chapter 2, is more about looking backward, and it's more about nostalgia. And so in simulationism, you're looking backward because you're discontent with the present, and you're curious about how things might have been if something else happened. So Avalon Hill's game Gettysburg, which lets you reenact this crucial battle in the Civil War, not only for a different emotional outcome, right? Like the Confederacy wins, and depending on how you feel about that, yay or really, really, really boo. Simulationism is all about that sort of vibe. And so I do think that war games, although it's all often argued that they're simulations, I think it's more accurate to describe them as laboratories of simulationism, where people get to run these sort of thought experiments of what might have happened if only General Lee had turned left here instead of right? Would there have been a different outcome? Would we be living in a different country? And I do think that that's where you see that sort of correlation happening, because that's an opportunity for some folks to activate this sort of white supremacist imagination. Great question. Any other questions?
Aaron, I believe I am live. Apologies for this. My Razer Kiyo camera just decided this was the best time to shit the bed, so to speak. Yeah, thank you so much for surfacing this question, Kryborg. I was just going to ask. Catbam Kapow asked, I'm curious if Aaron has seen a through line of white womanhood in gaming. I know that white masculinity might be more prevalent, but I'm really curious about how whiteness, womanhood, and domesticity overlap here. And there's a connected question from Cyborg Gray. Curious if you have any insight on trans or agender or tomboy type of AFAB folks. TL Taylor shared that they can fly under the radar in gaming spaces as folks who don't perform femininity.
Oh my God. Both of these questions are excellent questions. I've got more insight on Kat's question, I think, than I'm assuming that's Kishona's question, but I will say I do think there's promising new research coming out. I think of P.S. Burge's research as research that tackles specifically some of the sort of trans questions that are happening in the sort of hobby gaming space. But I will say that within my research on the topic, I didn't see much trans identity surface, although it might have been tomboy identity for sure. Folks like Lee Gold and some other historical women like Penelope Naughton Dickens, I would probably describe, at least through the writing, as kind of tomboyish. So I think that's a really interesting sort of layer right there. About the question of white womanhood and domesticity that Kat asks, I love that question. The very first thing that I think is interesting about that question is that when we get to the hobby gaming space and start thinking about domesticity, it actually does become sort of first of a few inversions where not only do you see a lot of men operating in the space, really claiming a lot of that domestic area of their own. Like I think Nick Taylor's work on man caves is being a good example of a lot of what was happening there. You know, people going into the basement, creating their own like terrains and stuff for their model trains and war games. But you also have men who prefer the domestic, who prefer to be tinkering in their basements, and who try to carve that space out of the domestic. So I see a domestic masculinity in a lot of these spaces. In terms of the sort of white womanhood in gaming and what's happening there, historically, I think you see women and white women specifically in the hobby area and in gaming as being some of the drivers of inclusivity, at least from the 1960s to like the aughts. And I think you see this because within these sort of male-dominated spaces, women and white women in this case were often themselves marginalized within the community. And so I think that women throughout the history of gaming in these spaces were often the voices arguing for inclusivity and making space for other people at the table. I don't know how far that extends into a conversation about race. I know from some of the interviews I've done with folks like Lee Gold that she was very accepting of people of different races at the table. But I also don't know if that acceptingness went over and spilled over into a sense of like accommodatingness or like going out of their way to advocate or make space for new participation in the community on that level. I will say that I think in like the hobby gaming space today, you see these conversations being sort of supported by people in a BIPOC coalition. I think of folks like Salt and Sass Gaming, Mandy and Suzanne are two wonderful examples of people in the board game community doing this. You also have Elizabeth Hargrave, who is sort of been cultivating a school of female designers and minoritized Black BIPOC designers also, as well as Eric Lang. So I do think that the present here sees people more aware and really trying to push for inclusivity in a lot of different ways in the community. So I kind of veered a little away from womanhood there, but I do think that you see that is a through line throughout history around womanhood. Great question.
Thank you, Aaron. We've got two more questions that have surfaced in the chat. Oh no, a third one. All right. Well, first, so Lifried in the chat mentioned that Kalmbach codes as a Jewish name, and was wondering how you think about the issue of sort of Jewish race within this broader project, particularly when we get into this kind of, World War II revisionism that's taking place kind of later in the century. Is that a vector through which you've been able to give consideration to these historical materials?
Yeah, Kalmbach does code as a Jewish last name, although I will say that he was not Jewish because he was actively working for several Christian presses in the Midwest. So I think it's a good impetus for the question, but he was not a Jewish figure in the community. I'm also Jewish, and so to some extent, I'm thinking about my own participation in the community when you ask that question. But I clearly, if you look at Avalon Hill, and you look at the material that was presented on Avalon Hill covers and Avalon Hill war games, I don't think many Jewish people would have been comfortable with that sentiment. And that's sort of the inner network of hobbyists, the stuff that was happening on the Avalon Hill General, some of the stuff that was getting published in the fanzines that spun off from it. So in terms of the people who were afforded that network privilege, I'm sure there were some Jewish people in that community, but it probably was not many because of the sort of dog whistles and microaggressions that were happening there. So I think I'll leave it at that. I'm sure participation grew over time for a variety of reasons. I for sure know that war games were not concerning for my family growing up. They were more concerned actually with Wolfenstein 3D because of the Nazi imagery in that game. But I'm sure it was a topic of conversation for some fans and family.
Okay. Thank you. So coming in hot from Garlic Breads 420, they asked, are there any examples of simulationism where it happens in reverse? So where historical events turn out better for people of color and white supremacists get thwarted, or is the play performance here kind of always a white power fantasy?
That's an interesting question. I really appreciate that question. So yeah, I had never thought about simulationism as a particularly unique to white groups. Although I do think that within the genre of games like Gettysburg, they kind of encouraged white supremacy, right? Like rethink the Civil War. There's going to be a specific audience of people who are interested in that narrative. I do think in board games today, you see some counter narratives around simulationism. There's a game called Freedom, the Underground Railroad game. It's a historical game that's a sort of retelling of the Underground Railroad. Has some problems with it, of course. Black people, like they are in many games, are represented with brown cubes that move around on the map, so that's a problem for sure. But the narrative of the game is trying to help people flee the South via the Underground Railroad in the 19th century. And so I think in games like that, you see simulationism kind of working in less of a conservative narrative.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Another great answer. And A question from M. Tatanka, Tony Brave. Is there something about train hobbyism that for you has particular resonances with US colonialism that gets pulled into tabletop gaming? So wondering about kind of tech hobbyism as white settler move to innocence, things like that. That, like, you know, why trains, right? Is a sort of great starting point for a question.
Yeah, I love that question. Yeah, and for sure, I do think that within the model train hobbyist community, it is aligned with a lot of the things that we classically think about with boyhood and masculinity in the 19th century. So you have like a frontier sort of mindset, and you have model trains as sort of like drivers of modernist progress, churning through the 19th century. And also you have this sort of use the slur, but the sort of cowboys and Indians mentality there happening also. So I do think that you see U.S. colonialism occurring a lot in model trains, and that, of course, is one of the sort of compatible things with a lot of the fans that were playing with those toys at the time, the sort of white boyhood that was being inculcated in those spaces. I would even add that this vibe continues today. I'm playing with some friends Ticket to Ride Legacy. Ticket to Ride is a very famous strategic train game where you lay trains on tracks and stuff. And I know with that game, they hired a cultural consultant to write a whole essay on sort of colonialism and the Wild West. But when it came to publishing it, they removed the narrative from the game, and they basically wrote like, well, we couldn't write this game without making it a story about fun. So there were some problems in the 19th century around race and the frontier and robber barons, but please ignore them and just have fun with our game. And you can still find I believe Jason Perez wrote it, but you can still find his actual essay on the topic on Board Game Geek if you Google around enough. So the problem persists within the hobby itself, and I do think that it's particularly compatible with that identity position.
Yeah, absolutely. That seems to be the wind down from the audience chat. Thank you, Aaron, for all of this kind of incredibly rich talk, these references, these, you know, future points of research that we can look to. Also, apologies to everyone for our little tech mix-up. You know, Aaron, it's again a total honor and pleasure to have you here. And for those of you still hanging out in the chat, please, if you haven't already, sign up for the newsletter. Get an RSVP for our talk in March with Yaroslav Svelch. And, you know, check out our May fundraiser. And if you feel so inspired, please do donate. We appreciate all your time. I'll hang out in the chat till folks are done. Aaron, let us know. Where can we follow you and your work?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky. My username is Aaron Tram, AARONTRAM. I have a website, aarontrammell.com. It's rarely updated, so you can follow it there. But honestly, the best way to follow me is to just give a holler. Reach out on Facebook even, or send me an email at trammell@uci.edu. It's 2 M's and 2 L's. And I'd just love to chat with anybody who wants to talk more about this. So thank you, Lane and the rest of the ROMchip crew and board for hosting me. And yeah, please do support, donate to ROMchip, and sign up for that newsletter so that you get the latest as they come out with their material.
Incredible. Thank you so much for that additional pitch. We will, Aaron, will let you go. I know we are running short on time, and I'm happy to hang out here for anyone, if anyone has questions about the journal, how to participate, things like that. But yeah, Aaron, thank you so much.
No, thank you. It has been an absolute pleasure. And thank you all for the wonderful questions. Talk to you later.
Thanks.
I will